Enshrouded has a really interesting design mechanic. It's called the Shroud. It's an environmental gameplay system which adds choice, challenge, and immersion to the world. So how does what just looks like a bit of fog add so much gameplay? Well, I'm Andrew Chambers, and let's dive in. A new survival action crafting RPG, Enshrouded, is a combination of Zelda meets Valheim. While it does a lot of things right, something that caught my eye was an environment gameplay mechanic called the Shroud. This feature, reminiscent of Niflheim in God of War, or the Visions of N'Zoth instance we designed for World of Warcraft, focuses on areas of the world that have been covered in an evil fog. When you enter the area, a timer appears, which starts counting down ominously. If you don't leave before the timer runs out, you very quickly die. This timer mechanic creates a sense of tension and challenge to everything the player does when they're inside the fog. With some clever and deliberate design choices, this seemingly simple mechanic creates a great deal of depth and gameplay for the player. Let's deep dive into some of those design choices to see how they've done it, and talk about what opportunities might exist to expand on it in the future. When you enter the Shroud, it's noticeable. The fog sets in, the music changes. All these work together to change your mood while inside the Shroud. This sets an emotional connection to the player. You feel afraid, you feel intimidated. This is especially great as it ties strongly to the overall story of the world. It's a clear indication of what happened and your personal motivation. From what I could gather in the demo, something happened ages ago which caused this shroud to begin growing, slowly covering whole swaths of the world, making those areas inhospitable, and causing everything to turn, well, all gross and mushroomy and lethal. In game design, we often refer to this as environmental storytelling. This is a big part of why the Shroud brings a lot of value. It quite literally immerses the player in the narrative of the world. Beyond simple storytelling, having clear gameplay mechanics tied to it reinforces its value. Of course, they could have just chosen to have the fog with evil mushrooms and left it at that. But by adding gameplay to it, the player feels a deeper connection to it. You're actively thinking about how you would deal with it, thereby creating this stronger sense of connection to the narrative. There might be even more that could be done here though. Early on, the game establishes you as some kind of flame keeper. They reflect this whenever you get near a torch, that it immediately lights, like a little glowy thing comes out of you and lights the torch for you. I kind of wonder if there isn't value in tying that to the Shroud as well. For example, renaming the timer Inner Flame, and add effects whenever you're inside the fog to show that the fog is being pushed back by that power surging within you. The more you can holistically tie these kind of systems to some narrative, the stronger and more cohesive they feel to the player's experience. Whereas in God of War's Niflheim and World of Warcraft's Visions, where the fog is limited to very small areas of the world, in Enshrouded, they've spread it out all over the place. Along with it being visually compelling and of course tied to the narrative, by spreading it out, it helps to break up the overall landscape into these approachable and threatening spaces. An important aspect, of course, is that ensuring that the Shroud isn't everywhere. Not being everywhere gives the world a built-in sense of variety. But knowing that access to these areas is limited or restricted, it adds tension. And this tension creates a choice. As a player, you think, do I want to spend time in that area of high risk right now? Or do I just want to go explore for a bit? On top of that, while inside the Shroud, there are key locations that you can aim for that allow you to regenerate the Shroud timer. This creates even more interesting choices while inside the Shroud. You can aim for these and use these as center point locations for your exploration. Something I noticed in the demo is that there's a moment where you destroy the Shroud root as part of a quest called Clear the Elixir Well. The narrative leads you to believe that the well is something that's creating the shroud. I thought that would clear out the shroud in that space. It didn't, which is unfortunate, as it kind of let me down with regards to the story, the quest that was being told. And I also thought that this could be a really great moment, players being able to clear out the shroud, even if it's just for a period of time, allowing them to more freely explore. Whenever you're inside the shroud, there's an extra element of risk that you need to be mindful of, represented by an ever-present timer at the top of the screen. This is core to the gameplay mechanic, which connects to the tension created by the environmental storytelling of the fog. And did I mention some gross mushrooms? So why a timer? Why not just use a health bar? Many games would just put an icon up on the screen and tell you that you're in an area that you shouldn't be and slowly do damage to you. Honestly, that's probably a miss. Health is a distinct system with its own vectors of progression, its own array of items in order to mitigate its loss. These kind of systems, like the weather system in Zelda, are actually pretty narrow. Once the players solve the problem with gear, it's no longer really something they care about. They just put the piece of gear on and they never need to think about it again. It's a very one-to-one problem to solve. By creating their own timer, it creates a broad system with a lot of clarity. It's a timer. Most players are going to instantly understand that it's counting down and that you know how long you have. By creating a separate system like the timer, it also allows for the designers to create their own progression around it. If you look deeply into Enshrouded, you can see that mitigation is all over the place in the progression. You can see elements of the skill tree. You can see it as part of the base upgrades. There's items that help. There's also consumables that help extend the timer. All these elements create a lot of variety and interest for the player to explore, and ways to feel like they're progressing. As it stands in the demo, I found like it was a bit too easy to negate the negatives around it. The early timer is really generous, and there's lots of ways to overcome the effects. The cylinders, the beacons, they all allow you to spend a great deal of time inside the shroud. Honestly, I'm a little concerned that it's going to become too easy to negate the negative effects of the shroud, making it really just feel like a cosmetic difference. I've personally experienced this when creating a system like this that puts negative pressure on the player. We often get feedback that, hey, this feels bad. So our desire is to make people happy, so we change it to make it easier. The downside there is that you take the teeth out of it. You lose the element of it that made it feel good in the first place. I also think there's an opportunity to have something that affects the timer, both negatively and positively. For example, when you take damage from a certain creature, it reduces your timer, or maybe there's an item that when you do damage with it, it can increase how much timer you have left. Something we tried on the Visions in Azoth, which I felt was really successful, was the shared item that would create a safe zone that also replenished their timer. I'd also suggest that it's worth trying to add more risk. There are certain items that you can only get inside the shroud. Maybe if you die or while you're carrying them inside the shroud, you lose them, they expire. Having these really tangible, high risk items add to the feeling of tension while you're in the shroud. I'd also suggest having something that affects the timer both positively and negatively. For example, a creature that can drain your timer, or a certain weapon that when you do damage with it, it can increase your timer. The benefit to this is that it makes the time that you can spend in the shroud a bit more dynamic. With other factors having an impact on that timer, it creates a more dynamic experience. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any thoughts or questions, go ahead and put them down below. Do you like this system? Do you not like this system? What other games have you seen that did this sort of thing well or poorly? Let's keep the conversation going. And hey, if you like what you saw today, go ahead and hit the like button. It really does help. And if you want to hear more of this sort of thing, why not subscribe? Thanks. Have a good one.